YouTube on point today. And Facebook on point today. Oh my goodness. They let me go. I done tagged. Let's get it, y'all.
Lots full of bones, don't try to put them back together. I know just by my tongue, so wear it like a scarlet letter. Wear it like a scarlet letter. I really love you.
Quiet in the court for the courtship, marriage of the dork and the gorgeous. Took her from the king of the corpses. He revolved, jumped the wall of the fort with the horses. This is for a toe. Bojangles was tapping in Morse code. At least to the man genius. Tap secrets and more gold. From the guts of the mother, can't push a mover undercover. With a $3,000 son, she just wanna love her and somebody else to come and try and try her. Take off the grill, she done. Pill celebrating, we won. In the system, other women never knew we had it in them. This condition, what in the world did they make them become? Cocaine and new high-tech ways, smuggle whole things. From the control range that make radio heads with gold brains. They bought 84 Jags on gold chains. Developing nicks from a whole name. God is great, but it's snakes on my soul plane.
Lots of full of bones, don't try to put them back together. No, just by my tongue, so wear it like a scarlet letter. Wear it like a scarlet letter. Not amazed, yeah. Would be the death of me and not amazed, yeah. That's just my anatomy, not amazed, yeah. Would be the death of me and not amazed. Tell me what to do.
Limo to the limit, fill it to the brim, get in it. You can't get it if you gotta ask. In that case, I want 2 masks. Bottom class, dollar cash, popping tags, dropping trash and shopping bags. Till Hakeem take our pocket cash.
Am I beautiful?
Ride it in lights, Molly in the body of Christ. Drop me to the lobby from heights. Then over the threshold to redeem the doorway. 14 bras like the king of Norway. 14 bras having dreams of foreplay. 14 arms Shiva, viva la cool. If the government get it, I'm a fool.
Lots full of bones, don't try to put them back together. No, just by my tongue, so wear it like a scarlet letter. Wear it like a scarlet letter. Not amazed, yeah. Would be the death of me, not amazed, yeah. That's just my anatomy, not amazed, yeah. Would be the death of me, not amazed,
yeah. Sanskrit dance on the page of the dead book. Don't leave the restroom with the left foot. Flags of Tibet, to death, flesh. Release the leash on a fast car. Feet on the keys, fall asleep in a Jaguar. The tip of that sword is white. Am I a knight? Am I black? Am I light? Have I been this? Realize my begin when I find where my end is. Oedipus Rex. Motherfucker, this better than sex. Material poached in the love of my mother. Currency soaked in the blood of my father. Scat bury you, let the wind carry you farther than I could. An anatomy, not of me, not me to it, not me to it. Eyes of the eye and others watching me do it. Adapting each rubric, Kubrick and plot and tone. Lots of bones, skulls to the top of tone. To skim through it, it's just skin to it. It's so thin, you see the sense through it.
Lots full of bones, don't try to put them back together. No, just by my tongue, so.
Yo. What's going on, y'all? Welcome to Coblow'S Daily Therapy. I missed y'all yesterday. I was down at the Freedom Riders event. They had observance for the Freedom Riders, so I'm back today. Still just coming with one chapter, though. Welcome to Coblow'S Daily Therapy, reading from the book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Washington. I repeat, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present. That's up until the day. It goes all the way back to when they met up with black people in Africa and did what they did. King Leopold all the way up to chattel slavery, feeding babies and alligators, they call them gator babies. All the way up to the Tuskegee experiment, up until the AIDS vaccine, up to smallpox, up to amputation, uranium injection, exploitation, display. You just name it, man. There's so many human rights violations towards black people. So I'm starting on chapter 3. Still in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is titled Race, Technology, and Medicine. And then on part 3, I'm on chapter 13. Chapter 13 is entitled Infection and Inequity, Illness as Crime. And in this chapter, the passage that I'm on is AIDS. This is the passage I'm starting on. So here we go. Turn this down. Since it's the end. Well, I ain't got to do all that. AIDS. In 2002, HIV infection outstripped the Black Death as the single deadliest pandemic in recorded history. According to the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, 40.3 million people across the globe are infected with HIV, and 3 million died of AIDS in 2005. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most heavily affected region because it is home to 64% of new HIV infections. I'm going to refer you to Cold Case Hammerscroll on that. Closer to home, HIV now constitutes the third leading cause of death for young adult African Americans, those between 25 and 44 years of age. In 2004, the CDC determined that most of the AIDS cases in the United States were diagnosed in African Americans. As this book went to press, AIDS was being diagnosed in Black Americans at 10 times the rate as in whites. It is 25 times more common in Black women than in white women, and 10 times more common in Black men than in white men. Nearly all American children infected by HIV, approximately 83%, are Black or Hispanic. But one reads more about the tragic plight of sub-Saharan African children than about the children in our own backyard. This observation plays into a perception by many African Americans that because AIDS strikes the marginalized, concern and sympathy have been largely replaced by the stigmatization, moral judgment, and deadly indifference. In the 1980s, however, AIDS was first identified in what was then an equally marginalized group, gay white men. They were widely maligned as people with reprehensible lifestyles whose behaviors put them at risk for what was dubbed, quote, the gay plague, end quote. When it became clear that intimate relations between gay men and others were facilitating the spread of HIV into populations previously thought immune, such as straight whites, this misplaced moral disdain escalated into accusations that gays were sources of contagion and that their behavior needed to be restrained by public health laws. The debate was encapsulated in San Francisco journalist Randy Schultz's controversial social history of the pandemic's early days, and the band played on. Schultz detailed the role of Gaten Dugas, known as, quote, patient zero, who knowingly infected many other men. But gay men's behavior was not heavily circumscribed because fierce debates over the human rights and dignity of gays ensued, and thus few of the proposed constraints were enacted into law. Bathhouses that facilitated anonymous sex were closed, but the public health department made no attempt to trace men's sexual contacts, to quarantine those infected men who refused to protect their partners, or to force men to divulge their HIV status. Certainly, no one was jailed. In fact, Cuba was almost universally condemned for its claim that it had contained the HIV epidemic by quarantining the infected. Thus, the standard public health tactics of infection control, including contact tracing and selective quarantine, were rejected in the early days of the epidemic, when they might have had the most usefulness in stemming the spread of the pandemic. However, the focus of the pandemic shifted as Black people were infected in large numbers, and they became identified with the vectors of the disease. HIV was very early posited to have an origin among people of color, though it was first found among whites. By the late 1980s, medical journals and news media referred to several classes of the HIV infected. There was early and frequent reference to innocent victims of AIDS, quote unquote, which intimated the existence of other, presumably, quote, guilty victims. The innocent included infected children, such as Ryan White, and such sympathetic exemplars as Kimberly Bengalis. What they had in common, besides media sympathy, was white skin and virginity. Ryan White was a 10-year-old boy who had been cast out by his school because of the HIV status, and whose family had been persecuted by fearful neighbors. This sad tale of cruel discrimination against a sick child was narrated by newspapers and television everywhere, and was punctuated by frequent reminders of his innocent status. He had not contracted HIV from a sexual encounter or injected drug use. Neither had Kimberly Bengalis, another, quote, innocent victim who had been infected by a dentist implicated in the possibly intentional infections of several other patients we never saw. Before his demise from HIV disease, Bengalis was constantly profiled, and her courage, religious faith, and ravished youth made it impossible not to sympathize with her plight. Her virginity, which certified her status as an innocent victim, was mentioned in a high percentage of the news stories describing her plight. But in the demographics of HIV infections, began to change as HIV preyed upon the marginalized, the Africans, and in this country, the poor and Black. Early newspaper stories on the shifting demographics were given little prominence. Neither were reports that the rural South was emerging as an epicenter of infection. But by 1987, a sea change had taken place, and news reports informed us that HIV affected a much larger percentage of Blacks than whites, that it had become the chief killer of young African Americans, and that most children with HIV were Black and or Hispanic. First in the minds of many Americans, and finally in grim reality, as certified by CDC statistics, AIDS had become a Black disease. Ain't that how racism works? Just like coronavirus now, right? Not all the news about AIDS and Blacks is bad. Although too often, silence greets helpful news or hopeful news that contradicts AIDS status as a Black disease. For example, although journalists publicize and celebrate hopeful news about white men who have resisted illness despite long-term HIV infections, a resounding media silence followed similar tidings about groups of African women who by 1997 seemed to have achieved what the best laboratories in the world could not: the power to ward off HIV infection. Over 6 years, 10% of a group of the Nairobi prostitutes under the study remained uninfected, although each had sex with hundreds of men. The resistant women didn't use condoms or receive medical care any more frequently than their infected counterparts. Scientists aren't sure how the bodies outwitted the virus, but human leukocyte antigens, HLAs, smart proteins that recognize foreign invaders are probably the chief factor. Leukocytes. So maybe that's a melanin type of melanin trait too. Many vaccines have been designed by studying people who display puzzling immunities. For example, Edward Jenner first perfected the smallpox vaccine in 1796 after studying milkmaids who became immune after contracting the more benign cowpox. The Nairobi women have the potential to be today's milkmaids, the source of a life-saving vaccine out of Africa. So one might expect these women to be the focus of media and popular speculation. But popular references to Africa's natural immunities have disappeared, although medical research continues to explore their potential as promising domestic pockets of possible disease resistance. American attitudes toward people with AIDS have also mutated from protective to punitive. More restrictive laws have evolved into the litmus test for public health advocates and legislators who wish to be perceived as addressing the pandemic. This other passage, still under the passage of AIDS, still up under this passage. Testing children, still pertaining to AIDS now. The term innocent victims has largely disappeared from newspaper pages. Not even the infants were tested for HIV without their mother's knowledge, or the African infants whose mothers lost their prophylactic AZT when using drug trials ended are now specified as, quote, innocent victims. I'm going to read that again. The term innocent victims has largely disappeared from newspaper pages. Not even the infants who were tested for HIV without their mother's knowledge, or the African infants whose mothers lost their AZT when U.S. drug trials ended are now specified as innocent victims. Children with HIV are increasingly finding their status as that of involuntary research subjects, not victims. In December 2004, for example, the journal Nature Medicine reported that since the early 1990s, HIV-positive orphans have been the subjects of dozens of national clinical trials run by researchers at Columbia University Medical Center and other New York City area hospitals. Mammoth pharmaceutical corporations such as GlaxoSmithKline, the manufacturer of another AIDS drug, have sponsored the testing of antiretroviral, and other pharmaceuticals on scores of HIV-infected orphans housed in New York City's Incarnation Children's Center, ICC. The institution for the HIV infected is run by Catholic Charities in Washington Heights, a neighborhood where Columbia University conducted fenfluramine violence studies, as detailed in Chapter 11. The ICC orphans were born to HIV-positive mothers, and their parents either are dead or have been deemed unfit to care for them by the courts. Within ICC's walls, Columbia University Medical Center physicians manage AIDS drug trials approved by the Pediatric AIDS Clinical Trials Group, PACTG, a network that imposes standards for and evaluates clinical trials for the care of HIV-infected children. These trials were supported by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, with the approval of the New York's Administration for Children's Services, ACS. Catherine Painter, MD, the medical director of Incarnation Children's Center, acknowledges that ICC is affiliated with Columbia Presbyterian and receives HIV-infected children from 6 New York hospitals: Columbia Presbyterian, Harlem Hospital, New York Hospital, St. Luke's Roosevelt, Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, and SUNY, as well as from outpatient HIV clinics in the city, in the 5 boroughs, and in Westchester. She also verified that as was mentioned in chapter, let me get this page on still. In chapter 11, the children are subjects in the testing of experimental drugs. Quote, many of the clinics that refer to us are participating in clinical drug trials, end quote. She told the New York Press in 2004. Children participating in a drug trial undergo monitoring, testing, and supply of an experimental drug through their outpatient clinic, and we maintain that treatment here, end quote. 36 experiments were conducted at the ICC between 1997 and 2003, and GlaxoSmithKline sponsored 4 of these. The center's experimental activities are not unique or even unusual for New York, according to the BBC, whose November 2004 television documentary, Guinea Pig Kids, noted that, quote, over 23,000 of the city's children are either in foster care or independent homes run mostly by religious organizations or on behalf of the local authorities. And almost 99% are Black or Hispanic. Researchers and ICC staff characterize these clinical trials as therapeutic, intended for the benefit of the children, and researchers agree that pediatric drugs require testing in children because children metabolize and react to medications differently than adults do. However, children's advocates question the therapeutic nature of those experimental drugs, pointing out that they have debilitating, even fatal side effects, including anemia, muscle wasting, organ failure, fatal destruction of bone marrow, the site of red blood cell production, life-threatening liver disease, cancers, bodily deformations, brain damage, painful and fatal skin conditions, and likely genetic mutations, liver swelling, unsightly fat deposits, and skin necrosis, death, and slowing of the skin. Some of the candidate AIDS medications are being tested to determine their toxicity. Children as young as 4 were given cocktails of up to 7 potent medications, although physicians are normally reluctant to give young children even approved powerful medications. Little, if any, benefit accrued to the infants from these risky exposures because although some were HIV positive, they were too young to have developed AIDS. One study is of, quote, stavudine, alone or in combination with didaceline, a combination that has killed adult women. An experimental vaccine administered to children as young as 12 months utilizes live chicken pox virus, quote unquote, even though it can trigger the disease itself. A study titled, quote, HIV levels in cerebrospinal fluid, end quote, required that infants undergo a spinal tap, a risky, invasive, and painful procedure. There was even a study on HIV-negative children that used an experimental HIV vaccine. By law, such a non-therapeutic study on healthy children can convey only minimal risk, but the vaccine's risks are unknown. Also, some of the experiments did not involve HIV therapeutics. One drug trial tested a herpes medication, quote, for tolerance, safety, and pharmacokinetics, end quote, pharmacokinetic information. Another investigated reactions to a double dose of measles vaccine in 6-month-old infants. For its part, Columbia University released a statement denying that the drug's side effects were serious enough to warrant discontinuing treatment. However, this should have been the parents' call, not the universities or the ICC. But guardians and parents who adopted HIV-infected children have found that ICC ACS, and researchers arrayed against them when they have tried to take children off medications they found to be harmful. In explaining her take on this struggle, Dr. Painter has said, quote, "We're having an increase in referrals over the last year to deal with medication adherence. There are a fair number of children whose HIV illness may be well controlled, but whose families are experiencing difficulty complying with the child's medication regimen. By referrals, Painter means children who are torn from parents and returned to the various agencies when these parents and guardians balk at dispensing the investigational drugs. Federal law gives parents the ultimate right to decide when the promise of an experimental treatment exceeds the and side effects and gives them the right to withdraw a child from a clinical trial at any point in the experiment. But most of these children have no parents, or their parents have been deemed unfit by the courts to care for them. The children are too young to give legal consent to participate in the HIV studies, and their legal guardian is the city or an allied governmental agency, which is the same entity that has committed to conducting the trial. The New York City Department of Health enrolled the children in drug trials in the early 1990s, and the city's ACS gave permission for the ICC children to be used. The agency receives funds for hosting the trial and needs a minimal number of subjects. Therefore, it should not also be the arbiter of the children's participation. It is not disinterested and cannot be objective. Yet the agencies are allowed to enroll the children as research subjects en masse, although federal regulations require individual consent for each child. In fact, the ICC forces the medications upon children over the objections of foster or adoptive parents. Mona Newberg, a New York City teacher, adopted her great-niece and great-nephew and removed them from the ICC in 2002. She refused to sign papers permitting her children to be used in AIDS experiments, but told a journalist in the fall of 2003 that, quote, ACS has signed for me when I didn't want to give Sean, her adopted son, drugs. When I said no, the ACS caseworker grabbed the form and said, I'll sign it. You don't need to. They're always switching medications. They never ask me if it's okay. Wow, end quote. Jacqueline Horger is another foster parent and one with a unique perspective. She is an experienced pediatric nurse who worked at the ICC for years before she fostered two children as a prelude to adopting them. One Saturday morning, ACS came to the door, accused her of child abuse, and seized her children. Her crime? She had withdrawn them from the experimental AIDS medications and insists that they had become happier and healthier. As a medical professional, she is better able than most to ascertain whether the benefit of an experimental drug justifies the harm it is doing the child. But ACS has prevented her from seeing her children. Painter seems to validate Horger's account when she describes the ICC policy toward compliance with the investigational drug. Quote, what we're asking of our families and patients in terms of adherence is something beyond 100%. All of their medicines all the time, whether they have them on hand or not, whether the medication makes them sick or whether they're sick with a concurrent illness, end quote. Despite Horger's status as the children's foster mother and her medical training, the ICC trumps parental consent for those children. Such a scenario evokes the question, is the state's chief motivation a desire to maximize the children's health or its own desire to complete AIDS research protocols and to get the funds from that? The BBC documentary claimed, quote, if the children refuse the drugs, they're held down and have them force-fed. If the children continue to resist, they're taken to the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital where a surgeon puts a plastic tube through their abdominal wall into their stomachs. From then on, The drugs are injected directly into their intestines. End quote. ICC spokesperson Gerald McKelvey acknowledged that the city sometimes took children from foster parents who had refused to administer the drugs, but he denied to Nature Medicine that children were ever forcibly administered medication. Quote, of course, some kids were reluctant, as kids are, to take their medicine, end quote. He said it was not children, however, but recalcitrant parents, some of whom were medical professionals who were reluctant to administer medications because of the debilitating effects on the children and the fear that they were being exploited as non-consenting subjects. For several years, U.S. research protocols with African American and Hispanic children, who constitute virtually all the American children living with HIV, have exposed an alarming willingness to jeopardize their health and rights. And that is the end for today. Tomorrow I'll still be in AIDS, reading a public health dragnet. Man, this is some very unjust stuff that went on, man. Devastating. I mean, just real terroristic, barbaric, cruel things that went on. But that is the history of this country. I could keep on reading, but let me see. I got a few minutes. I'll stop right there. Look, I want to thank y'all for tuning in. You know what they said? If you want to keep something from a person, especially if I'm a black person, to put it in a book. We don't like to read nothing. All you got to do is put it in that book, and they ain't going to go get it. They don't like to read. That's what they say. Well, you know what I'll do? I'll go and I'll get that book, and I'll find that information that they claim you don't want to know, and I'll come and bring it to you like a delivery service. And they also said that you can lead a cow and a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. Well, I still bring that water to you because I look at this information in these books as water. It's all vital to our survival. So this water that's in these books, I go get it and I deliver it to you like this UPS right on your front doorstep. But like they said, I can't force you to drink. I'll bring you all the water you want. I cannot force you to drink. So it's up to you to come get this work. Indeed. I'm out of here, y'all. It's Coco, baby. God's, baby. Coblow'S. Peace.